Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
"You're not welcome here anymore," my brother whispered, barely loud enough to register above the creak of the hallway floorboards, as he slowly pushed the door closed in my face. I didn't flinch, didn't raise my voice, didn't beg. I just stood there, keys in hand, still wearing the same hoodie I'd worn for 2 days, while scrubbing the kitchen and patching up the drywall Brenda's kid had punched a hole through last week. I didn't say a word. I just turned, stepped off the porch, and walked down the driveway, the soles of my shoes catching the gravel like tiny sparks. Behind me, the door clicked shut with finality. What they didn't know, that house wasn't theirs to close me out of. It had been my money, my name on every damn bill for the past 7 years. And in exactly 48 hours, they'd be opening another door, a legal one, nailed right to their precious front porch, printed in bold black letters, eviction notice. But let's rewind a little, because nothing like this happens overnight. You don't just get kicked out of your own home by your own blood unless something's been rotting for years. And this house, this family, had been rotting since the day our mother took her last breath in the upstairs bedroom. I moved back in when Mom got sick. Not for drama, not for sympathy, just because someone had to. Nick had a job an hour away back then. Brenda was pregnant with their second, and frankly, neither of them was willing to give up their lifestyle for an old woman slowly fading away from lung cancer. I was the obvious choice. No husband, no kids, just me and my job as a night shift supervisor at the plant. I packed up my apartment, left my life behind, and moved into that house with the creaky stairs, ancient furnace, and too many memories. I fed Mom, changed her bed sheets, wiped her tears when the pain meds wore off. And when she finally slipped away, peaceful and quiet like she lived, I stayed. At first it made sense. The house was half falling apart. The roof leaked every time it rained. And the mortgage was in a mess of legal confusion after Dad died with no will. Nick couldn't cover the payments. He had just gotten laid off, and Brenda's idea of contributing was ordering less takeout for a week. I stepped in, no speeches, no ceremony. I called the bank, consolidated what I could, took out a personal loan, and kept the lights on. No one ever asked how the bills got paid. They just got paid. Over the years, my role shifted, from caretaker to silent housekeeper, from sister to invisible servant. I paid the mortgage, fixed the plumbing, bought groceries, even covered the back taxes one year, when the city sent that ugly red-lettered envelope to our mailbox. Brenda stopped speaking to me directly sometime in year 4, except to ask when I was going to move out and get my own life. Nick started referring to me as her, like I was a roommate they were too polite to kick out. And the kids, they barely knew me. I was just the lady who cooked dinner and did laundry. It built up slow and quiet like mold behind wallpaper. I'd come home from work, exhausted, and find Brenda's sisters drinking wine in the living room I paid for, laughing like I was the help. I'd walk into the kitchen and see Nick throwing bills on the table, bills I'd later pay, without even looking at me. But I said nothing, not once, because for some reason, I believed it would matter someday that I was the one who held it all together. Then came last Thursday. It started with a casserole. I had made it the night before. Left it in the fridge for the family since I'd be at work late. Brenda claimed it made her sick, said it had gone bad, and accused me of trying to poison her in front of her friends, as if I had some secret vendetta. Nick didn't defend me, just stood there looking tired, like I was an inconvenience that had finally crossed a line. I laughed, couldn't help it. A short, bitter sound that slipped out before I could stop it. That laugh is what pushed him over. His voice low, firm, unfamiliar. "You're not welcome here anymore." And now here we are, me walking away without a single protest. But that's the thing about quiet people. When they finally move, they move with purpose. I wasn't going to argue, because I didn't need to. I had all the receipts, all the power, all the documents that said this house is mine. I stopped at the bottom of the driveway, took one last look at that peeling blue siding, the window where Mom used to wave at me from. the crooked porch swing Nick never fixed. Then I turned and walked toward my car. The late spring wind catching the edges of my coat, I slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and drove off without checking the rearview mirror. And you know what the funniest part is? They still don't know, not a single clue, that for the past 7 years, every cent that kept them afloat came from the very woman they just tossed out like trash. But they'll find out. Not from me yelling or begging, not from revenge that comes with a baseball bat or screaming matches. No, my revenge is paper. Legal, cold, and undeniable. They closed the door on me like I was some unwanted guest. But that house has always been mine. And now it's time they learned what happens when you push the wrong woman too far. When I tell people that I walked away without saying a word, without shouting or sobbing or demanding an explanation, they look at me like I'm some kind of saint or lunatic, depending on their mood. But what they don't realize is that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's just a calculated breath before the storm. And I had been holding mine for far too many years, waiting for the moment when everything I carried for them would finally come full circle, not because I needed revenge to feel whole, but because I needed them to feel the weight of what they so easily discarded. There was a time when that house actually meant something to me, more than a roof, more than bricks and beams. It was the place where I had spent every Thanksgiving curled up on the scratchy carpet watching the Macy's parade with Mom while the turkey roasted too fast, where I'd snuck sips of Dad's beer when no one was looking, where I first learned that family didn't always mean fair, but it used to mean together. And for some reason I thought that meant something to Nick too. Thought that after everything we'd been through, he'd remember how hard we fought to keep that place after Dad died and left nothing but debts and broken tools behind. But memory's a funny thing. It wears thin in the spots that matter most. When I moved back in to take care of Mom, it wasn't some heroic gesture born out of obligation or duty. It was love, complicated, messy, exhausting love. The kind that keeps you up at night counting pills and rubbing a dying woman's feet even when you've got a 12-hour shift in the morning. The kind that makes you lie through your teeth and tell her she looks stronger today, even when she can't lift a spoon. The kind that makes you sit at the kitchen table alone at midnight, wondering how the hell you're going to pay the electricity bill and still afford her meds. Nick didn't see any of that. He visited once a week, sometimes less, always with a fast food bag in hand, and excuses about Brenda needing the car or the kids being sick. He'd sit with Mom for 10 minutes, take a phone call halfway through, and leave before the coffee even cooled. Brenda never came, not once. Said the house smelled like bleach and sadness, which I guess was fair, considering I spent every day trying to scrub out the scent of dying. When Mom passed, it was just me and the silence. Nick came for the funeral, stood stiff beside the casket, and left before we even scattered her ashes behind the shed, where the lilacs bloomed thickest in May, and that was it. No long conversations about what came next. No real plan. Just me in a house falling apart, with bills stacking like bricks and a bank account that couldn't keep up. So I made a choice. It wasn't grand or dramatic. One afternoon, while staring at a shut-off notice for the gas, I walked into the local credit union and refinanced the house. The mortgage had been delinquent since Dad died, and the only reason we hadn't lost it years ago was because the bank forgot we existed. I put the loan under my name, paid off what I could, and started chipping away at the rest. Nick never asked. Brenda never cared. As far as they knew, the house was ours, some mystical relic passed down like a family heirloom, untouched by the real world. But I knew better. I signed every paper. I bled into every payment. I worked double shifts, skipped vacations, let my teeth rot in the back because dental work cost more than the house insurance. There's something bitter about sacrificing everything and being thanked with silence, or worse, entitlement. Brenda started calling it her kitchen, told her friends she hated having someone else's sister hanging around. Nick, who once cried into my shoulder after his layoff, started talking to me like a landlord he couldn't wait to get rid of, ignoring the fact that the only reason his kids had heat in winter was because I stayed up until 3 a.m. negotiating bills with creditors over the phone. And through it all, I said nothing. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because every time I opened my mouth, I could feel this knot in my throat. The kind that comes when you realize that no matter how much you give, some people will always see you as a burden if they never had to carry anything themselves. So I swallowed it, again and again. I told myself it didn't matter, that I knew the truth, that someday, maybe they'd see what I'd done for them and feel even a flicker of remorse. But people like Nick and Brenda don't feel guilt. They feel discomfort, and they call it persecution. They feel entitled, and they call it fairness. So when they finally told me to leave, I didn't argue, because the war had already been won quietly behind the scenes. In 7 years of bank receipts, tax documents, and a signature they never thought to ask about. And now, as I sit alone in this quiet motel room 2 towns over, eating takeout off the plastic tray, and scrolling through the digital copies of every financial record I've kept since the day Mom died, I can't help but laugh. Not a bitter laugh this time, but a real one, because everything they think they own, everything they think they earned, is about to slip right through their fingers, and they'll never even see it coming. So let me ask you something. If your own family pushed you out after you saved their asses year after year, if they erased your presence, belittled your work, and finally slammed the door in your face, would you let it go, or would you do exactly what I'm doing now? Wait in the silence, sharpen your tools, and let the truth hit them like a sledgehammer when the papers arrive. Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't loud. It's just long overdue. There's something peculiar about revenge when it's not fueled by rage, but rather by quiet calculation. When it simmers under the surface, not in dramatic outbursts or slamming doors, but in the silent, methodical way a woman can gather every piece of truth, sharpen every detail like a blade, and wait until the exact moment when the cut will be felt most deeply, not just in pride, but in stability, in comfort, in the very foundations someone has grown foolish enough to believe will always be there. After I left the house, after the whisper and the slammed door, and the humiliating walk down the driveway that should have broken me but instead clarified me, I didn't call anyone, didn't text a single soul, didn't rant on Facebook like Brenda would have. I drove straight to the small-town bank where I first signed the papers that saved that house from foreclosure, where I stood 7 years ago in a too-thin coat and handed over my pay stubs with hands still raw from washing dishes and sorting freight. And I sat across from the same bank manager, Sharon, with her fake pearls and clicky nails, and told her that I needed a full, updated copy of the mortgage agreement, every page with my name on it, every term and condition, because I was finally ready to remind my brother that ownership isn't defined by who gets to shout the loudest in the living room, but by whose signature keeps the roof above everyone's head. Sharon, to her credit, didn't ask questions. Maybe she saw something different in my face. Or maybe after years of polite small talk and on-time payments, she finally realized that I wasn't just the quiet sister helping out. I was the sole financial backbone of that sagging colonial house with the peeling paint and broken screen door. And when I walked out of the bank with that thick envelope tucked under my arm, I felt the kind of weight not of burden, but of certainty, like carrying the very proof that you're not crazy, not petty, not the problem, but the only damn reason that roof hadn't caved in on them years ago. That night, in the cheapest motel 2 towns over, I laid everything out on the bedspread. Bank statements, utility bills, tax assessments, proof of payment history, correspondence with contractors. Every receipt from the time I paid for the water heater after Brenda complained the showers were too cold, to the time I covered Nick's car insurance when he needed to drive to job interviews that never seemed to go anywhere. Each paper, each line item, was a thread in a web they didn't even know existed, because I'd been spinning it for so long under the assumption that doing right by your family didn't require recognition or gratitude, it just required love. But love can only bend so far before it snaps. The first step wasn't dramatic. I didn't call them. I didn't show up on the porch waving papers like some banshee in a crime thriller. Instead, I filed an official notice through the county courthouse. Nothing loud, nothing mean, just a simple eviction filing with all the supporting documentation attached. notarized and dated, listing me, Cassandra Lynn Parker, as the sole mortgage holder and legal owner of the property located at 148 Red Maple Drive. The clerk didn't even blink. To her, it was just another Tuesday filing. But to me, it was the opening move of a quiet war I had been conscripted into. The day Nick decided his pride mattered more than the truth. Over the next few days, I imagined the mail arriving at the house, Nick picking it up absent-mindedly like he always did, flipping through bills and flyers until he saw the official seal, the formal tone, the date to appear in court, the blunt legal declaration that he and his family were occupying a property they had no legal right to, and the moment of panic that would follow when he realized that the woman he kicked out without a second thought was not just a tenant or a relative, or a long-term guest, but the only reason the walls were still standing and the heat was still on. I didn't need to be there to watch it unfold. I could see it play out clearly in my mind. Brenda, loud and indignant, accusing him of lying or hiding something. Nick, stammering, trying to explain away the papers, to rationalize why there was only one name on that mortgage, and it wasn't his. The kids confused, watching the two adults who ran their homes suddenly lose control of it in the span of a few pages, a few official words, signed not in blood, but in ink. The thing about quiet wars is that they don't make noise until the walls start to shake. And even then, the real devastation comes not from what's destroyed, but from the realization that it was never really theirs to begin with. And no, I didn't enjoy it. Not in the way Brenda might enjoy seeing someone trip and fall, not in the way Nick might secretly enjoy feeling superior during an argument. But I did feel something shift inside me, something firm and grounded, the way the floor feels just a little more solid when you finally stop pretending it isn't rotting underneath your feet. So I waited. No phone calls, no texts, just silence, because the truth has a way of making noise all on its own once it's finally let loose. And when they came knocking, which I knew they eventually would, it wouldn't be to apologize. It would be to negotiate, to plead, to reason, but by then, it wouldn't matter. The papers were already filed. The clock had already started ticking. And I wasn't coming back to save them this time. By the time the sheriff's department posted the eviction notice on the weather-warped front door of 148 Red Maple Drive, the weight of 7 years of silence had finally landed. Not like thunder or fireworks, but with the dull, heavy impact of reality setting in, pressing against the chest and dragging down every ounce of denial that Nick and Brenda had wrapped themselves in like a threadbare blanket, far past its usefulness, and I didn't have to be there in person to feel the ripple. It was in the quiet calls I started getting from mutual acquaintances, in the sudden texts from Nick's old high school friend asking if I was really doing this, in the way the people who used to ignore me at church started giving me these hesitant nods in the grocery store, like they weren't sure if I was the villain or the hero, or maybe just the fool who had finally figured it out. The call came the night before the notice went up. Not from Nick, of course, because his pride was thicker than oak and twice as dry, but from Brenda, whose voice was pitched just above civil, riding that uncomfortable line between forced politeness and barely restrained contempt. And she started the conversation with a tone that suggested she believed deep down that if she could just use the right mix of guilt and righteousness, I'd crumble and withdraw the filing like some scared little girl who didn't understand what she'd done. "Cassie," she said, her voice honeyed and false, "we need to talk face to face, like adults." And there was a long pause after the word adults, like it was a jab wrapped in satin, a reminder of how they always viewed me. Not quite equal, not quite competent. Always a step behind, always the helper, never the decider. I agreed, but not because I owed them anything, and certainly not because I was seeking closure or reconciliation. I agreed because I wanted to look them in the eye, just once, and show them that the person they thought they could toss aside had been holding the whole house together by the spine of her back and the strength of her silence, and that they were about to learn what it meant to lose not a person, but the foundation beneath their feet. We met at the kitchen table I had refinished with my own hands 5 years earlier, the one Brenda had since cluttered with chipped mugs and a plastic fruit bowl. and that hideous yellow vase she bought at a flea market because it was quirky. And as I sat across from the two of them, Nick with his hunched shoulders and down-turned eyes, Brenda with her arms crossed and her lip curled like she was doing me a favor, I realized that they still hadn't read the documents closely. Or maybe they just didn't believe they were real. Or maybe, in that special way some people have, they thought this could all be smoothed over with a few choice words and a performance of regret. "Why are you doing this?" Brenda said, and the question would have hit harder if it hadn't come wrapped in that familiar whine, like she couldn't quite decide if she was furious or insulted, or just confused by the idea that someone might finally stand up to her. I didn't answer right away. I just pulled out a manila folder and laid it on the table. Inside were copies of every relevant document: mortgage statements, repair bills, notarized filings, my bank transfers, and I slid them toward Nick, who looked at them like they were in a language he'd never learned. "I paid for everything," I said, my voice steady, not angry, not triumphant, just factual, the way you might tell someone the sky is blue or water is wet. Not just the house, the taxes, the roof, the furnace, even your damn car insurance when you got laid off. For 7 years. Nick opened his mouth, then closed it. Brenda snorted. "You never said anything," she snapped, as if silence was some kind of betrayal, as if my decision not to throw every receipt in their faces over the years somehow invalidated the reality they had comfortably ignored. "No," I said, "I didn't, because I thought it was temporary. I thought family meant you helped when help was needed. I thought someday it'd come back around, but you made it clear this isn't my home, so I'm just making sure it's not yours either." Brenda stood up fast, knocking over her chair. "You can't do this. You'll ruin us." And there it was, the truth, naked and raw, and finally spoken. Not anger, not righteousness, fear, because for the first time, she understood what was at stake. Not just a house, but the illusion of stability she had wrapped herself in for years. I stood slowly, gathered my folder, and looked at Nick, who still hadn't said a word, his jaw tight, eyes wet. Not with sadness, I don't think, but with the realization that he had gambled with the one person who'd never asked him for anything, and lost everything. "You did this," I said, "the moment you decided I didn't belong here, the moment you closed that door." I walked out before either of them could respond, before the tears or shouting or bargaining could begin, because I knew it was over, not just the legal battle, but the emotional tether I'd been dragging for years, the invisible cord that had kept me rooted in a house that never truly saw me. The sheriff posted the notice the next morning. Red Maple Drive was silent, except for the slap of the paper against the old wooden door. And in that silence, I imagined Brenda yelling, Nick pacing, the kids asking questions no one had answers to. But I didn't need to see it. I already knew what it looked like, because this was never about winning. It was about ending something that should have ended years ago, something I held on to, not because it was good, but because I didn't know who I was without it. Now I do, and they're finally starting to understand who I am too. There's a certain kind of silence that settles in after a storm, not the gentle, peaceful kind that wraps around you like a blanket and lets you breathe again, but the heavy, echoing kind that follows destruction. The sort of silence that exists when something permanent has been broken, not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate dismantling that leaves nothing loud behind. Only space where sound used to live. And in the days that followed the eviction, as the dust from the sheriff's posting settled over Red Maple Drive like ash, I found myself sitting alone in a kitchen that wasn't mine, eating eggs from a paper plate under fluorescent lights, staring at the wall and wondering how long it would take before they realized that I hadn't just removed them from a house. I had stripped them of the illusion that someone else would always be there to clean up the mess. The sale of the house didn't take long, which surprised even me, considering its age and the repairs it still needed. But the market was brutal that spring, and someone was always looking for a fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood with a good school district. And when the offer came through, just under asking, from a retired couple moving down from Vermont, who said they liked the character of the place, I accepted it without hesitation, without nostalgia, without even driving back to walk through it one last time, because I knew that every floorboard and window and rusted pipe held stories I no longer wanted to carry. And it was better to let strangers paint over them than to stand in the remnants trying to remember what had been real and what had only felt real because I had wanted it to be. I did return once, though, not to mourn, but to retrieve something that I had hidden years before in a fit of instinct more than intention. Up in the attic where the dust lay thick and the insulation sagged like forgotten memories, tucked inside an old blue box labeled XMS that hadn't been opened since Mom's last Christmas with us, when she was too weak to decorate, but insisted we still hang the stockings and play her favorite records like we always did. Because ritual meant something to her even when her hands trembled too much to hold an ornament. Inside the box, beneath a brittle garland and a cracked ceramic Santa, was the letter, handwritten on yellow stationery, sealed in a plain envelope, addressed to me in my mother's cursive, the same ink she used to write grocery lists and birthday cards. And I remember the day I found it, shortly after her funeral, when I was up in the attic searching for a photo album and instead stumbled across this quiet confession folded between years of forgotten cheer. I hadn't read it then. I couldn't. I wasn't ready to know what it said, wasn't ready to face whatever truths she'd chosen to write down, instead of saying aloud in those final, fragile days. But now, as I stood in the echo of that house one last time, I opened it. Her words were simple but steady, and they told me everything I had already suspected but never confirmed. That she had known Nick wouldn't step up, that she had watched the imbalance grow even as her strength faded, that she had added my name to the deed before she died, quietly, legally, without drama, and that she hoped, more than anything, I would forgive them, not for what they'd done, but for never seeing what I had carried, and for letting it become my burden alone. She ended it by writing, "This house is yours, Cassie, not because I'm giving it to you, but because you earned it, and you were the only one who knew how to make it a home, even when everything else fell apart." I folded the letter slowly, not with reverence, but with closure, and I placed it back in the envelope and tucked it into my coat pocket. Not because I needed proof anymore, but because some things, when said finally and fully, deserve to be kept close. The new owners moved in a week later. I watched from a distance, parked across the street in a borrowed car, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to the quiet clatter of boxes being carried in, laughter echoing off the sidewalk like it belonged there. I didn't feel bitterness. I didn't feel regret. I just felt done. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Nothing fancy, just 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, and a balcony that catches the afternoon sun in a way that reminds me life doesn't have to be large to feel good. And for the first time in years, I wake up without wondering who needs what from me, without listening for footsteps outside my door, without bracing for someone else's needs to override my own. And yet, sometimes at night, I think about them, Nick and Brenda and the kids, and I wonder how they explain it to each other now, how they tell the story of how they lost everything, whether they frame me as cruel or ungrateful or just crazy enough to do what they thought I'd never dare. And part of me hopes that one day they'll realize it wasn't punishment, it wasn't revenge. It was a choice made after 1,000 smaller choices went unnoticed. A boundary drawn only after every attempt at compromise was met with contempt. Because I didn't destroy the family, I just stopped saving it. And that's the part that sticks with me, not the loss of a house or a title or a shared holiday meal, but the quiet, shattering truth that some families survive only because one person keeps holding all the broken pieces together, and when she finally lets go, everything that falls wasn't taken from them. It was never theirs to begin with.